Hello and welcome to the Justin Center podcast. I am your host, Dr. Jordan Cooper. Thank you so much for joining me once again on the program today. Just a reminder that Justin Center as an organization is supported by donors, so we would ask that you would consider becoming a regular contributor or giving a one-time amount if you're able to do that. You can go to justincenter.org, go to our donate page there, and we do really need support to be able to do the things that we are doing here. So before I jump into the topic of the program today, I just want to let everyone know about a project that I've been working on for a while, something that's coming out very soon, and that is A System of Dogmatics by Revere Franklin Weidner, Volume 1, God and His Works. This is a hardcover volume. This is a proof copy here, as you can tell with the strip here, but this is a series that I've been working on for a while. I've wanted to do this for years, and that is basically to take Revere Franklin Weidner's systematics individual volumes, compile them into a 4-volume hardbound set, and fill in the gaps of areas where he didn't actually finish the writing. He died prior to finishing the set. But I want to fill in those gaps of those systematic theological topics that he was not able to address by using writings of some of his influence, people like Charles Krauth, who was his primary theological influence, who wrote pretty extensively on the sacraments, which is what Weidner was not able to get to. So I'm trying to compile things to kind of finish what Weidner really intended to finish and was not able to in his lifetime. So this is going to be, our first hardbound set we've ever released. It's through the Weidner Institute, of course, which is because it's Weidner. So, and we will be releasing other hardbound volumes as well in the future for some of our books. These are obviously going to be a little more expensive than the paperback ones, just because of the nature of it costs more to produce hardbound volumes. But you can purchase, the individual volumes in paperback in our complete works of Revere Franklin Weidner series. But this is really meant to be something that is akin to what Francis Pieper offers, which is a comprehensive, multi-volume systematic theology. Weidner is really pretty comparable, I think, to Herman Bavinck. They lived at the same time, wrote around the same time, and are dealing with a lot of the same challenges. So if you like Bavinck from a Reformed perspective, Weidner's something similar from a Lutheran perspective. I think he's better, obviously. So anyway, I'm excited, really, really excited about this. And, I've had people asking me recently, are you working on your systematics projects, your further volumes in your series? And I am. I've got 9 volumes set up, but I've taken some time to really kind of get this out. I think this has been a focus, because as much as I want to write things, honestly, Weidner's probably better than anything I could give you. All right, just wanted to mention that, but we can jump into the topic for today. So today I'm gonna be starting a series that I have, that I mentioned that I wanted to do before a little bit ago. And this is something I've been asked to do actually for quite a while. Now, I don't know if this is going to be like a limited series that's going to have kind of really an end point. I think this may just be an ongoing subject of the podcast moving forward. And that is the relationship between Christ and culture. And, the more that we are in a secular age, a post-Christian world, post-Christian culture, the more I think it is necessary for the church to engage a lot of questions related to how do we live as a church in a secular age? How do we survive as a community? How do we raise our children well? How do we raise our children to be faithful? And these are questions that I constantly wrestle with because I have kids, and I'm thinking about this all the time and having conversations with people, friends and family about this stuff constantly. So I wanted to spend some time just talking about this on the podcast. This doesn't mean that we're not going to be dealing with theological issues and dealing with cultural issues. The purpose of this is not really to be political in this series per se. We will talk about the role of the state for sure, but it's more to just kind of navigate secularization and to talk about what the church can and should do and how we navigate these issues as a church. So what I want to do in addressing some of this is to go through a series of books. I want to just go through some books. I'm rereading books that I haven't read in quite a while, and looking at different ways that people have encouraged us to address what we're facing as a culture. So I figured probably the best place to start is with Rod Dreher's The Benedict Option. And that's because that really has been quite foundational for a lot of conversations for a number of years now. Now, it's been a while since the book was written, so I'm going back and now revisiting it, and it's kind of amazing to me how quickly the world has changed and how quickly our situation has changed since that time. But I've kept up with, I read Dreher's book following that, Live Not by Lies, which I thought was a really excellent work. I think those books are both very good. I'm not always happy with the way that Dreher deals with things on social media, but that's another question. But in terms of the actual, publications that he's released, I think they're both very helpful volumes. That doesn't mean I don't have any criticisms of them at all, but I think it's a good starting place to begin a discussion of how is it that we do engage the culture, and how do we think about these things. Now, if you're not familiar with the Benedict option, I can just I'm going to give you a little bit of an overview and then present my thoughts on really what we can do with that, or whether we can implement that, and how it is that we can implement that in our culture today. So Dreher's book really, the foundation of it is not really from him, it's from Alistair MacIntyre, who spoke about the need to have a new Saint Benedict. Now, what's that about? Is this saying that we need to just renew monastic orders and we all need to go join monasteries? Well, that's not really the point. So the reason why MacIntyre brought Benedict into the conversation about culture and how we relate to culture as Christians is that it was in the midst of the fall of the Roman Empire and invasion of the barbarians. The social cohesion, the social structure of society that had existed in ancient Rome had really fallen apart. And it's not to say that there's no cohesion after that point, but you don't have this unified, Roman Empire like you did in the 4th century with the, Constantine and then the post-Constantinian church until you get to like 410 and Rome gets attacked, and slowly things get very, very weird in the West. So at a time when things are falling apart, Benedict formalizes monasticism. Now that there are plenty of monastic movements prior to Benedict, of course, but Benedict he writes the Rule of Saint Benedict, which is very well known. He creates Christian community in these monastic orders that have, culture and rituals and a way of life. And so MacIntyre calls us to really be new Saint Benedicts, or he says we need a new Saint Benedict. We need somebody else to kind of figure out how is it that in a post-Christian society like we're falling into, where things in the West are falling apart in a lot of ways in terms of meaning and purpose and politically, tensions and all the stuff that we're facing right now, how do we cultivate and create Christian community? And so we need to do something like St. Benedict did. Now, the purpose is not to say that we need to be monastics. And I think if you read the Lutheran confessions, they're certainly harsh about aspects of monasticism. And we could actually, I've always wanted to do a program a little bit on monasticism and just go through the history of monasticism and what the Lutheran confessions actually say about monasticism. But the Lutheran confessions are really critical of monasticism, as the reformers are, generally in some ways, but not in other ways. So the things that they're critical of largely are the works righteousness that develops as part of monastic piety. Specifically, the idea that to take monastic vows is akin to a second baptism, or the eschewing of ordinary vocations as somehow not as holy or not as sacred, as well as the idea that you find in medieval monasticism at Luther's time that a lot of people are kind of forced into monasteries to make lifelong vows, and they didn't really even have a choice to get there. Is that really the kind of thing that in Christian freedom we should be forcing people to do? So there are a number of issues with monasticism, but nonetheless, there are some positive things we can take away from some monastic movements in the past. And I think as we do look at the secularization of our culture, there are some positive things that we can take away from people like Benedict. And that's what Dreher is trying to do in this book. And I think ultimately he's right in the basic thesis that we need to do that. So there's the very, very brief summary of that. Now, Dreher goes on to give examples of how this kind of thing is being done and how it could be done and ways that we need to cultivate community. But I think the fundamental perspective that Dreher has here, which is the shift of the kind of moral majority movement, say, of the past, where there is this expectation that if we get the right political leaders, Republican leaders, specifically, of course, in the right offices, then by means of power and political influence, we can kind of re-Christianize our culture as things are falling apart. Now, Dreher recognizes that that's just not the case. That's not going to happen. That's certainly not where we're at. And I don't know a lot of people that at this point think we can somehow recapture the West in some political sense for Christendom. It's not where we're at. It's not our moment at this time. We have to recognize the reality of where we are as a culture. We have to recognize secularization, and we have to recognize the fact that we are in a minority. And instead of trying to like push back against that by creating political allegiances that often probably aren't healthy for us or going to work, we need to think then about how is it that we live as Christian community in an unfaithful secular culture, so that the situation that we're facing in the West, and probably will for the future, at least the immediate future. Now, I don't know what history is going to be like. I certainly haven't expected the world to be like it is. In 2019, if I think all of us saw what the world was going to be like now with the things we faced since then, we probably would all be kind of shocked. So you never know what's going to happen, and that's for good or for ill, and providentially things happen. But unless there is some kind of miraculous turn, which certainly is a possibility, but we can't count on that. We have to reckon with where are we now. We are in a post-Christian world. It is a fact that more and more people are being secularized in the church. People are leaving the church. I mean, look around the pews and see the people that are in your congregation. It's very likely that many of them are boomers and older, and not a lot of millennials like myself or Zoomers. That's just where we are. And people that have kids that were raised in the church have often left the church. So here's where we are. We're in a culture and a society that doesn't value religion really at all, at least in revealed religion. I would say that there is a religious element to every culture, because culture is essentially that which grows out of cult or worship. Etymologically, that's where the term comes from. Of course, etymology certainly doesn't tell you everything. The word could come from that and not actually mean anything related to that. But I think that there's a reason why the word comes from that, because culture really does come from cults, right? Culture really does come from worship. It flows out of religion, and I think that that's demonstrable historically if you look at culture. So we have our own culture in the West today that is growing out of its own secular religion, that it just cannot sustain itself. So what we need to do is create our own counterculture, and I don't think we do that with the intent of we take over the culture. We're not there right now. We're just not. We got to face the reality of where we are. And I know I see a lot of the post-millennial guys being very hopeful of where things are going, and ready to say we're going to bring about some kind of theocratic state in any near future. And it's just not going to happen. It's just not going to happen where we are now unless there is miraculous divine intervention. So that's the reality of what we're facing right now. So I think we could talk about then how this works itself out in a number of different areas in life. How do we cultivate that notion of Christian community? How do we cultivate a culture among us as Christians? And we're not talking about a culture, again, broadly taking over the state or taking over the West or something like that at this point. We're certainly not we're not anywhere near there. But we have to ask the more basic question of how do we cultivate it among ourselves? How do Christians get together? How do we raise our kids in the faith? How do we raise our kids in a way that they're actually going to hear about the values of Christianity and believe those things and have influences that are Christian? And I just want to I think through my life and think back to the people that I knew who are raised in the church, and often raised in a very isolated environment in a lot of ways. And most of those people have walked away from the faith. That's the reality of what I've seen, especially in the more kind of fundamentalist, don't ask any questions kind of churches. Think of the fundamentalist Baptist churches, especially, where there is a kind of sheltering that occurs that people aren't really allowed to ask questions. They're not intellectually prepared to face the world. And so when people in that sheltered environment come out of it and see the world, all of a sudden they're faced with a bunch of challenges, and they're faced with a lot of intellectual and moral questions that they just were never equipped to answer, because there was nothing robust about the teaching that they received. They weren't prepared to really deal with the world as it is. It was the expectation of the parents to kind of just shelter the child as much as you possibly can, surround them with other influences of people who believe like we do, but don't really engage intellectually and don't answer or ask difficult questions, because asking difficult questions can be, a sign of doubt or a sign of unbelief. And so you just kind of keep all that inside. None of that comes out. That's the kind of thing that we really don't want to do. And that is the danger of the Benedict option, is that people will look at this and say, well, what we need to do is create completely sheltered communities where we have people who just don't engage at all with the outside world and aren't prepared to deal with the world as it is. So I think that's a definite danger. And when I do see people coming from that background, they either stay within that sheltered environment because they're kind of scared to come out and look at anything else, or if they do come out of it for a time, they often walk away from the faith. Most often walk away from the faith. The other option, of course, the better option, being they find a more historically oriented, theologically robust Christian tradition that actually does address their questions. So that's the goal. That's kind of where you want to be. So I think as we think about a kind of Benedict option today, what I want to be clear about is that we're not, what I'm not talking about as something that is positive is being sheltered in the sense that you are not given adequate tools to address the challenges of faith, and not being in an environment where you cannot ask questions. That's unhealthy. That's what cults do. This is why cults lose people all the time. Well, and abuses of power and all the other horrible things that cults do to people. But like, if you see people that come out of cult groups, they often speak about how no questioning was allowed, and as soon as you ask one question, you start to ask more. And the pushing away of questions is what eventually often leads people out of those groups, because it is a cult that says you don't want people to ask questions. You don't want people to engage intellectually in a robust way. And that's certainly not how the early church dealt with things in a post-Christian culture. I mean, the earliest Christian writers, people like Irenaeus and Justin Martyr, were engaging philosophically. Origen or Clement of Alexandria, who, they have their weird issues in their theology in some ways, but they're attempting to engage the world. They're not attempting to run away from questions. They're trying to, and they are giving robust answers. And that's the kind of training that the early church had for a lot of people. So that the goal is you create your community, but you don't create your community based on hiding people from the reality outside of it. People have to be aware of the reality, and they need to be given robust answers to those questions. And that's the reason why the New Calvinism got so big when I was in college. And I'm a millennial, so I'm the right age, and I'm bearded, so I had to be part of the New Calvinism. But I was part of that New Calvinist movement at one point, probably actually more confessional than New Calvinist, but same thing. You get the point. The part of the culture. And I think a lot of us who grew up in that kind of evangelicalism of the 90s, it just didn't have any intellectually robust answers. There were no answers to questions. You don't really question. Everything is just about personal experience, my personal conversion. And if you have doubts about your faith, either like, well, that's just a sin, or you need to just look at some experience that you had. Well, I mean, that's so subjective. It's not a ground for much at all to say, go back to my conversion experience. Well, now I'm relying on my own subjective memory of a subjective experience and whether it was real or not. There's got to be something more rigorously grounded than that. And that was, I think, what was really attractive to a lot of people about the New Calvinism movement was it gives you a lot of answers. And finally, these are people who are like, I see your doubts. Let's talk about them. Let's actually address those theological issues. Let's not run from the question of the relationship between God and suffering in the world, but let's actually give you a theological reason for it. And Calvinism does that. Now, at this point in my theological journey in my life, I would say I don't think Calvinism does it correctly, but they do give an answer to it. And I think that was what was attractive to it, is they're actually addressing some of these very serious issues. So when we're talking about the Benedict option, then, if we want to implement something like this, it has to be intellectually robust. It cannot follow the Bill Gothard, and there are other issues with that too, but that kind of model of sheltered homeschooling that really doesn't prepare people intellectually to really engage at all. And they're also, those kind of movements are also new. They're not historically rooted. We're not talking about historically rooted Christianity. We're talking about a Christianity that is based on trends in the 20th century, and more founded probably on reactions against secularization than really just being rooted in the historic tradition itself. Where, if you get a movement that is more about what it's against than what it's for, that's a problem, and that often happens in history. And so I think a lot of those more kind of fundamentalist movements tend to be more like that. So on the one hand, we have that's one option, is to just totally shelter your kids, and that's not healthy to have that kind of sheltered community, and I haven't seen it work out well. But on the other hand, we have the other realities of what we see in the world around us, which is, when I was young, we had this attitude. A lot of parents had this attitude of their kids that, you send your kid to public school, because there's always a question: what do you do with your kids? If you're a Christian, do you send your kids to public school? Do you send your kids to private school? Do you homeschool your kids? What does a faithful Christian do? And one of the arguments for public schooling is, well, at public school, they can go be evangelists, right? There's a focus on witness and evangelization, and you can go out and evangelize to the pagans in your school. Well, what happens 90% of the time? Is it that the Christian kid converts the school? No. And am I saying that there are no instances of evangelization working in schools? Of course. Well, of course there are. God's still working through that. But we do have to ask the practical question, what usually happens? What's more likely? That this one student standing against the world? I grew up in Massachusetts, the most secular part of the United States. And there were hardly any Christians anywhere. And almost any Christian I know that went to public school. Do I know any that stayed in the faith? I actually can't think off the top of my head. I don't know. There probably are, but I'm really having a hard time thinking of anybody. But for the most part, they leave. They leave because you have, all of your peer influences are adamantly opposed to Christianity. They are, likely involved in witchcraft. This is at least where I grew up. And probably involved in drugs of one kind or another, and sexual promiscuity, and all the other stuff, and now gender politics, and that's your peer group. That's who you spend all your time with. You have pressure to impress those people. The teaching in the school is certainly not going to be from a Christian perspective. At the most, it's going to be just no religion included in what you learn. And, at the worst, it's going to be actively hostile to the faith. I know people having stories about teachers that were adamantly opposed to Christianity and would blatantly tell their students or make fun of students who are Christians or whatever. This happens all the time. Maybe it's just a New England thing. I don't know. But that's where I grew up. So that's what it is in that culture anyway. But when all of your influences are secular, and you go to church on Sunday mornings, and that's your Jesus time, and then at home your parents are probably working a lot, so they're busy, and it's not like they take a lot of time to catechize you at home. So they pray with you at night and talk about Jesus sometimes with you, and somehow the parents expect that little bit of training at home and the hour on Sunday morning and the little bit of Sunday school they get is somehow going to result in this active life of faith in this child, when every single voice that's speaking into them, from the media that they consume, to who they talk to at school, to their teachers, to every single other person and influence in their life, are all speaking against that. How do you expect to counteract that? And it baffles me how anyone thinks in our society today that is somehow reasonable. It's not. I don't understand. I don't understand and I know I'm being blunt here about this, and I don't want to get into the question of like, is it a sin to send your kids to public school? Well, I don't think I can say that or anything. But I don't, just practically, I don't know how you can do that. I don't know how you can do that and expect that your kids are not just going to come out completely secularized. Because I think the most, and looking at, a lot of kids today, especially with the gender politics in schools, I mean, how are you supposed to resist this? If you go to school and everyone says, if you don't agree with this view of gender that is being pushed, that is certainly not a Christian one or historically rooted one in any sense whatsoever. If everyone says that you're surrounded by at all times, if you don't agree with this, you're a bigot. If you don't, if you don't think this, you're whatever titles they want to place on you. How are you supposed to resist that? And especially as a kid. It's hard not fitting in as a kid. It's really hard, especially as like a teenager when you want people to like you and you want people to think you're okay, and you certainly don't want everyone to think you're some kind of horrible, bigoted jerk. And why would you want that? So it's just clearly you're gonna fall into that stuff. Like you're going to buy into those ideas. I just don't know what else to say about it. It seems very, very obvious. So obviously there are exceptions. I know that, but why make things as difficult as possible? So, and I'm thinking largely of kids when I'm talking Benedict option, at least right now, because I'm a father. I'm concerned for my kids, and I think the more I watch just what my kids are fed in the media with, the gender politics that's in, like Arthur or like these kids shows, Blue's Clues. I mean, these are, I had to like have a conversation with my then 5-year-old, I think, 6-year-old, whatever. I try to remember how long ago it was. I do know how old my child is. But about why he couldn't watch the cute blue dog on TV that he wanted to watch because of the ideology that was being presented in a children's show. It's horrific that we have to even address these issues. But it's the reality. It's the reality. We live in a reality and in a culture where everyone in the media, all of the major media organizations, okay, so I shouldn't make universalizing statements. They kind of hate you, and do you want to give them your attention? Do you want to make your kids watch their stuff and stick your kids in front of a TV and have them fed all of this information that is purposefully trying to subvert classical Christian ideals? Probably not a great idea. And yeah, I know I sound paranoid and whatever, but this is just an obvious reality. I think I don't really even know how you can deny this fact now. It is what it is. It's what we're living with right now. It's come to the point that I just don't even want to watch television shows at all, because I know that people writing the television shows are inevitably going to be pushing an agenda. And the fact is, those people hate me for what I think about gender and sexuality. So why am I giving them my attention and my money? It's not worth it at all. We should be creating our own alternate forms of media, and I know that. And most Christian media is terrible, so it doesn't usually work out very well. But oh well. I also think it wouldn't be the worst thing in the world for us to just not watch TV that much. I don't know. Go back and read classic literature. I don't know. Or read your Bible or whatever. Do something else. Spend time with actual human beings in person instead of staring at them on a screen. Or I spend time watching operas and I do watch some TV, but I think we have to limit how much we do. So that's just the reality of where our culture is at. So the Benedict option says we recognize that about culture. So what we have to do is then create our own culture as the church. So we don't want to go on the one hand with the complete sheltering of Christians from like anything in the world at all in a way that is not intellectually robust. But we also can't just kind of throw people out into the culture and say, well, as long as you hear about Jesus at home sometimes and you go to church and you have, a Christian friend, you're good. So And the difficulty in terms of navigating this is we have, a twofold calling as Christians. And the one is the church has a calling to evangelization and mission. That is completely true and valid. And part of what the church is called to do, we have the Great Commission. We are called to bring the good news to the world. We are not called to just hide it among ourselves and go live in the hills, so totally away from society and not talk to anybody. But we are also called to remain steadfast in the faith, to keep ourselves in Christian community with influences that are going to have a positive impact upon us and our faith, and help us to form ourselves as God forms us, of course, but as like people who live ethically, who live in a way that is consistent with our calling as God's people. And we are called to raise our kids in such an environment that they are equipped. Iron sharpens iron. So how the difficulty is navigating how those two callings of the church go together. And I think at least when I was growing up, I think the focus that I had seen in the church was very much on that witness and evangelization end of things. And that's good. That is the calling of the church. But when you are so in the world that you don't have a rootedness in yourself and those influences upon you intellectually and morally and spiritually to form you as a Christian, it's often going to be that they are more evangelizing to you with secularism, and then you fall into that and you walk away. That is just the pattern that I've seen over and over again. And I think, I don't know, maybe this isn't good, but my focus as a parent now, it's like my mindset has shifted. The more I see influences in the world on kids, especially, is, I think like I used to be very kind of evangelistically minded, I feel like, in a lot of ways, and now my mindset has shifted to, I just want to keep my kids in the faith. Like, I just want to make sure that my kids are Christians, and I want to make sure that they don't go crazy. And like, I've got to start there. And I'm not saying we shouldn't focus on evangelizing. We should. But I think we have to stay first and foremost rooted in our own community and then evangelize from there. We have to have the rootedness in our Christian communities. We have to be rooted enough in our faith that we can go evangelize and go do mission and go interact with the world, but be rooted enough that we're grounded without just being taken by those things. And oftentimes I think it just doesn't happen. So how do we then foster this kind of community? How do we foster, Christian community in a culture where, I talk to people, especially, because I have a lot of Lutherans that listen to me since I'm Lutheran, and not exclusively though, of course. I know a lot of you are not, but you especially talk to Lutherans who say like, look, I'm at a church and it's great. The pastor preaches law and gospel. I receive the sacrament, but I'm a single 26-year-old man, and the next youngest person in this congregation is 45. Well, that's hard. It's hard to create community in that kind of environment, especially when you're like, I want to get married, I want to have kids, and people are like, well, how do I have community? How do you have connection? Now, I'm all about intergenerational community. I think that's actually hugely important. It's certainly something that's biblical. We have the necessity of like older women training younger women that Paul mentions. So the notion of like creating churches for generations, like, well, our music appeals to the young people, our music appeals to the boomers, whatever, that it's specifically anti-biblical. And I know that it's a strategy for reaching people in some churches, but it's a non-biblical strategy. And I think we just should give that up. So I absolutely think that, that kind of intergenerational community is part of the benefit of the church. Is you have a community where not everybody's the same. Not everybody thinks the same in every way, because you have different experiences, different cultures, different backgrounds, maybe a lot of different ethnicities. You're very different people, but you all are united by Christ. And so there's huge blessing in the sharing of those various multitudinous experiences and personalities and backgrounds and all those kind of things. Those things could be, a great blessing. But when you don't have, first of all, a spouse, anyone or any options, your church, which is the case for a lot of people. And I do think one of the things that as we look into the future of Christianity and what Christian community means, we have to do that with a recognition and attention to the fact that there are going to be a lot more single people in the church. Because it is getting increasingly more difficult for Christian people to find someone who actually shares their values and is also a Christian. This is going to be more and more difficult. I mean, I see a lot of people who are, who would have thought that they would have gotten married years ago, and they're, much older than they expected when they thought, according to their, plans or what they were told or what their parents told them, you'd get married at this age or by this age. And that's not necessarily going to happen. That's just realistic. You have to be honest with the culture that we're at. So I think that's something that we have to pay a lot of attention to, is in our communities, the reality of a lot of people that are going to be single, people that are not going to be married and are going to be much older and not married. And that's also okay. And we need to make sure that they have a part in our communities as well. I think because of the neglect of family that is so strong in our culture, we tend to want to react extremely and say, well, our communities should just be about families. Everybody should get married. And I think we rightly are speaking against the culture that doesn't value family as the foundation of society as a whole. But we also have to recognize with historic Christian tradition that there are people who are committed to celibacy, at least for a time. Doesn't mean that that's their calling forever. But there are monastic communities that developed very early on in the church, and that's been something that's been part of our tradition forever. So we can both highly regard the family and also highly regard those who are not married as just as essential in the kingdom of God. Martin Chemnitz actually says that it's a higher calling not to get married than it is to get married, which when I first read that in Chemnitz, I was like, oh my gosh, this is so opposed to like how we think of things today. But he does that in writing against the abuses of monasticism. So he even says like, he's going in a very different place, I think, than a lot of people want to go today. So I think what we don't want to do is overreact it's only about families and not give a place for single people in community either. That's not a healthy thing for those people or for our communities. And that's simply just being consistent with what the church has always done. We've recognized the variety of callings in terms of family and marital life. All right. So then getting back to those, who are, say, married and have kids who are in the church, and say they're the only kids in the congregation. Well, how do you form your kids in a Lutheran perspective, for example, when you don't have any other Lutheran kids their age at all? All of their friends are not Christians, or that they're the only people that are around, or they're all Mormons because they live in Utah, or whatever. We need to have, we are formed by the communities that we are with, and there's today the blessing and the curse of the internet. Because the blessing of the internet in the age of secularization is you can find like-minded Christians online. And so, I've made friendships through the internet. Louis Polzien, who's been on this program many, many times, and I met through Twitter. So but we've also met in real life and are real life friends, not just internet ones. But those things can be a blessing, but there's also... It also doesn't replace face-to-face relationships. There's something very different about actually being in community and living life together with other people. Like living life with other Christians actually around you, being part of the same community, having your kids play with each other, inviting people over for coffee, being able to have Bible study at your house. These are the kinds of things that you just can't get on the internet. And I recognize, some people are in those kind of communities, and you've got a church where that kind of stuff is possible, and you do that. But I think those of us who are living on the coast, so the Northeast, I live in New York State, it's really tough. It's really, really hard. And I see this also from people like in the South who are Lutherans. They say, well, we have Christians that we're friends with, but they're like, fundy Baptists who are very different and skeptical of everything we believe in too. So it's a little bit of a different kind of kind of thing. And it makes it difficult. So what do we do about that? Well, one thing we do first is, you can use the internet, and there are some blessings to that. I think that you can make real friendships with people via the internet. And so there are some very good and beneficial things about that. But is there more that we can do? Can we establish communities for us and for our children, and for us to be able to fellowship with other people really in person? And it's something that I think is going to be more common. And this is something that Dreher is predicting in this book, is that there will be and he gives examples of this. There are some Roman Catholic communities particularly that do this, but I think that it will be something that will be more and more necessary and more common for people to move into a particular area to have Christian community, because it's really hard to be an isolated Christian. It's just really, really hard, or an isolated Lutheran. You even if you're surrounded by other Christians, it can feel very isolating. So I think we'll see more and more of this desire for people to actually be together face to face. And I think this is more possible with so much work becoming remote work, is people are able to be a lot more flexible about where they live. My wife and I can live wherever we want, technically, with our jobs. We're rooted here for reasons of family and schooling for our kids. But in terms of jobs, you've got options if you're doing things from a distance. So that has opened things up in a lot of ways that weren't possible before. So what I would love to see, and I want to look at some people who have talked about what the Christian village or Christian community actually looks like and how to establish that kind of thing, and look at maybe some real life examples of where this thing happens. But what I would love to see is the establishment of communities where individuals come together to live in the same area, so that they can raise their kids together, so that they have a Christian environment, Christian culture. They can use their church as not just a place to come Sunday mornings, but as a kind of community center, and a place which is what used to be the case. I mean, at one time it was, architecturally, you've got the church built in the center of town, and especially like the medieval towns. In a medieval town, the church is really the center of the community. You build the church in the center of the community. Everything else is built around the church, and all activities in the life of that town occur at the church. And I think there's something of that we can bring back. Now, what I don't want to do, and I think this is something you often see with people who are talking about culturally how to do these things and Benedict option kind of stuff, is people often romanticize the past, and I don't think we want to do that either. It's not a healthy way to move forward, is to say we need to bring back the 13th century or something. I think we have to recognize the reality of where we are today. So we can't just go back. And I don't think it's a matter of just saying, well, let's destroy all of our towns and start over architecturally. It's not going to happen that way. But can we grab onto some of those ideas in the past and incorporate them in the modern world? That's where I think we really need to go. And that's where I think we can do that in a way that is, very, very productive and good for us. So that's something I would love to see, is actual real life communities, people coming together, actually living near each other and forming congregations, and then using that as kind of an outpost and then growing from there. Because there, I think when you have a strong church and a strong community that is built together, then I think the evangelization can come out of that and be a lot stronger from there. Now, I do want to say this, because I think there's some dangers in the way that we tend to do everything in the United States. Well, not just the United States, but the West in general, is we're really obsessed with celebrity. But that's largely a U.S. thing, not exclusively, because we kind of ship that everywhere else. But the modern notion of celebrity is largely something from the U.S. But because we have this celebrity idea, the problem is that when Christians want to create communities, when I've seen this happen, it often surrounds just one individual who becomes the kind of celebrity focal point. So you have a bunch of, I think you see this with Doug Wilson in Moscow. Now, my point isn't, and I have some things that I disagree with about how they do things and how he's handled certain things. But my point isn't to, bash what they're doing in Moscow. But I do get weird vibes, I guess, about people talking about the reason why they move and uproot their family to go to Moscow, Idaho. And so part of that is they want Christian community, and I think that's great. And they want to have Christian schooling, classical schooling. And so, okay, that sounds great. But largely when I hear people talk about this, they want to go there for him. They want to go for Doug Wilson. That's the kind of language I often hear. And that, a lot of alarm bells go off when I hear that. And I think there's the danger, and that's just always going to be the danger, which means we always need to be on guard against it. The danger is I follow celebrity X, Y, or Z, and I go where they go. I'm going to move here because I like this church. And why do I like this church? Because I like the pastor at this church. And this is something I think we have to be very wary of and very careful about. And Dreher talks about this throughout his book as well. And how the monastic communities didn't do that, right? They were communal. They weren't surrounding an individual. Now, do you have to have an individual leader to kind of, take charge and lead these kind of initiatives? I mean, yeah, like that's practically, you got to do that. But you have to also have systems of accountability. You've got to have systems of that maybe initial leader stepping out from a leadership role after a certain point. There are things that you can do to navigate it so that it doesn't become this guy wants his little kingdom or something, which I think can happen. This is what you see with cults, right? And sometimes cults don't start as cults. They start as attempts to do communal things, but then the person in charge likes the power, and then it goes crazy. You don't want to have that, and that is a temptation. So I think we've got to be very, very, very aware of that. But then we have how you can implement this just in a practical way at home. And there are a lot of things about monasticism that can be really helpful in incorporating into our own spirituality. This is something that's, familiar to more liturgically oriented Christians like myself and the Lutheran tradition and Anglicans and Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox as well, is that in a more liturgical spirituality, there's structure. There's structure to your day, there's structure to your year. Right now, as I'm recording this, we're in the season of Lent. So part of the structure is our yearly cycle really changes how we think about a lot of things. So during certain times of the year, we celebrate certain holidays. It changes our attitudes. It changes what our focus is going to be. It changes the clothing that we wear. We're in different moods when it's cold or when it's warm. A lot of what we do does surround yearly cycles. So when you have a church calendar and you have something like the season of Lent, it means that your conception of time is being reoriented throughout the year around your life of faith. So my conception of time is around where we are in the church year. So now we're in Lent, Advent, then we have, Pentecost, and we have these different seasons of the year and different church holy days. And when we do that, we are orienting our lives and our time around holy things. So that this means that this helps us to incorporate our theology and our faith in Christ, incorporated in our conception of time. And of course, that happens weekly. We have a liturgical week. I mean, this is why we have the creation week in Genesis 1, which then is echoed in the life of Israel. It's a liturgical week because at the end is the Sabbath. Now we celebrate our weeks with coming together on Sunday, the 8th day, as some of the church fathers called it, but the day of the resurrection. So that every week is oriented around this calendar, this liturgical calendar, and then every year is oriented around the liturgical calendar. And we can get more specific in terms of individual days, so that in the day we have certain times of prayer during the day. And this is something that people can, and I think it's very helpful to implement. Now, it doesn't mean we'll always be as good at it as we want to be, or as consistent, speaking for myself anyway, as consistent as we want to be in these kind of things. But it was something that the early Christians did. They took up the daily office. So there were certain hours of prayer. Now, these hours of prayer were things that in the Roman culture, They had, the ringing of bells at certain times of the day. You don't have like your, watch you can just look at to know what time of day it is. So those bells would tell you that it's, it's dawn, it's 12 o'clock, so it was like every 3 hours or so, you'd have those bells ringing throughout the day. And Christians said, let's take those times to pray. When you do that, your time in every day is oriented around God, right? Your time is oriented around your faith. And then your week is oriented around your faith. Your year is oriented around their faith. So this notion of sacred time, I think, is really key to kind of recapturing a daily culture and a routine that is an outgrowth of our faith. And no, I don't believe that these things are divinely, commanded. So these are traditions, but I think they are very helpful traditions. There is a reason why these traditions have been kept up for so long. And that's what you see going on in the monastery. You have set up regular times of prayer and a regular schedule of prayer and work and community time together with other Christians. And there's something about that we can use to orient our own lives each day, each week, each month, and each year. Now, of course, the way that occurs in a monastery is going to be much more intense than it would occur in a regular, ordinary Christian life, because we're not all free to spend our time just praying all the time. We've got duties and responsibilities. If you've got kids and you've got maybe 3 jobs, it's you maybe have crazy things going on all the time, and it's really difficult. So I think when people try this kind of stuff, I think when they try to implement that kind of spirituality in their life, they oftentimes try to do it in such a way that's like they jump into something overwhelming. What happens when you jump into something overwhelming like that is that you give up because you don't do it, because we're failures as human beings, and we make commitments that we don't keep, and some of it's just impossible with the time that we have. So those things don't always happen as much as we can't always jump into like the extremes, right? But it's just a matter of incorporating those things in your daily life, incorporating those things just in what you do during the day. The pattern of your day surrounds those things. Doesn't mean every hour of the day is spent in prayer. It's not about burdening yourself, because you can make your life of prayer can then become this kind of work, which is what happens in a lot of medieval monasticism. But it becomes this kind of legalistic work of, I have to pray X amount every day. And it just becomes this burden because it's this extra thing you have to get done during the day, where prayer is really is supposed to be something restful, right? Because a prayer is coming before God passively and acknowledging you can't take care of your life, praising him for who he is and what he's done for us in Christ, and then asking him to pour out his blessings upon us. Like, he welcomes us to ask him for things. Prayer is not, I go to God to go up this ladder of spirituality, but prayer is me going to God and confessing my weakness and asking for his aid. I mean, that's really what we're doing when we come to God in prayer. But petitions, we're not saying, God, I did a great job today. Please recognize how great I am and whatever. Like, we're coming before God saying, I'm a wretched sinner. Please forgive me. Have mercy upon me and my soul. So if we recognize that's what's going on in prayer, I think it takes the burden away from being this kind of just duty of you have to do it. It's really, that's a very wrong kind of mindset to approach prayer with. And then when you're talking in the family then, because there's that personal kind of liturgical time. So that's one way to orient your life in a Benedictine kind of way. Something that everyone can do in some ways. Because not everybody's going to be able to be like, we're going to start a Christian community and move wherever to be with all these other Christians. Like, yeah, of course, I'm just saying these are things that I think could happen and could be beneficial. I'm not saying these things are going to happen everywhere at all times. So there are things you could just do in your own life. There are things you can do as a family, orient your family around times of worship. Make sure that you have prayers that you say before meals. Actually sit together and have meals together. That's really, really key. That's something that my parents instilled in me as a kid, when I feel like most other kids I knew just got home and sat in front of the TV and ate TV dinner or whatever. My parents always said, nope, we sit together and eat dinner. And I know as a kid, I was like, that's dumb. My friends get to play video games during dinner. They don't have to sit with their parents and talk to them. Of course, now I'm like, this was absolutely what every family should do. And I'm thankful. And now I've passed that on to my kids as well, who also get annoyed that they can't play video games through dinner, but that's okay. But actually spend time with your kids at dinner. Have certain times of the day where you're actually a community. And when you do that, incorporate your life of faith into that. Pray before meals. Pray before bed. Have memorized prayers that you teach to your children so that they have, you teach your children to pray spontaneously as well, which I think is very good. But give them the tools and the words and the language through memorized prayers, which really aids them in many profound ways. Make sure that you pray for them when something is wrong. Something that Dreher points out in his book is how you live this out in the family is confessing your sins to your kids sometimes. Now, okay, let me say what I mean there. I don't mean being vulnerable with your kid and pretending like they're just a buddy that you can share everything with, because that's like, there are boundaries and that's inappropriate. But I mean, when you act out in anger toward your kid, right? When you're mad about something else and they ask for something, you kind of snap at them and then realize later, you can go to them and be like, I'm sorry, I acted out of anger. Please forgive me. It's something that we've tried to do with our kids. And I think it's really important. It's important that you do that, because then you are trying to create a culture of repentance and forgiveness in the home, and you model that. And if you're married and you have kids, you can show forgiveness to your spouse, and that is something that your kids will see. They will notice that. They'll see how you interact with each other, and it will help to form them. So, and then there's the question of schooling, of course, is how do you train your kids? Now, again, I'm not going to give you a hard and fast rule about all of this, but it's really hard to send your kids to public school. And I know people that do it, and I know people, when you do it, it's almost like you got to get home and counter everything that the kid learned in school, which seems so difficult. And I also recognize, of course, states are different, and I know not every public school is the same. But you do have to seriously consider how it is that your kids are being trained, and what kind of influences your kids have. So are you having your kids spend time with other Christian kids that that their parents are living out these values in their life? Do you feel safe with your kids around those people? Do you know those people well enough? And of course, you never really know. So there's always that's the fact. There are people that say they're Christians and they're like horrible and do terrible things that I can't say because it'll get me demonetized. So, there is that reality too. So it's not like this is because I think some people have this idealized view, right, of, well, it's all Christian people and they're with Christian kids, everything is going to be good and fine. And that's just not reality either. So, being a parent is kind of terrifying, isn't it? Those who are parents, it's a scary thing. It's like you're just constantly paranoid and worried about your kids. At least I am. I don't know. So those are just some ways to kind of practically live this stuff out. But I think we also need to make sure that we have preparation for community. We can create community in other ways. We can start organizations. We can have clubs, and we can do more than just the church. And I'm not saying that these things aren't connected to church, but it's also good to just have community that's in person, that is beyond just stuff on the internet or church on Sunday mornings. And it's good to have communal Bible studies, of course, but it's also good to just have friends and get together with people and do things to help your town, whatever it might be. And I know those things are like what older people do, and we're not part of those clubs or whatever anymore, but I think we probably should be. Yeah, I really do. And I would like to see more of that kind of stuff implemented, what's called localism. Of course, the problem I have with a lot of people who promote this stuff online is they don't really do it in real life. It's just kind of this theoretical thing. And here's really the question that I want to really address throughout this as I look at this some more, is how do we actually implement this? Because I think there's a lot of theoretical talk. I see a lot of people talking about the architecture of communities, or people talking about, how we can reorient things as a society, how sad it is that we've moved away from community, how sad it is that we've moved away from different community groups and the church being this or being that. But the fact is, I see a lot more like lamenting these things and talking about these kind of theoretical ideas of what would make society better, but I don't see nearly enough just doing something. So I want to talk about ways that we can actually implement some of this practically. And I think we can look at some examples of that and talk about maybe ways to do that yourselves in your own lives. I know it's a complaint I got about my book, In Defense of the True, Good and the Beautiful. If you haven't ordered a copy, make sure you do. It deals with some of our cultural decline and why that is, but it doesn't really offer much of a solution. Now, I want to start talking about what the solution is. If you have read the book and you liked it, by the way, leave a review on Amazon and Goodreads. That always does help. All right. Well, I've hit just about an hour here. So I thank you so much for listening and or watching this. And I hope this was somewhat beneficial to you. And make sure you do subscribe on YouTube and in your podcast app. And we'll see you in the next one. God bless.